Welcome. My name is Dr. Caroline Heldman, and I am the Executive Director of the Representation Project. If you're not familiar with our work, we are a nonprofit gender justice organization founded by Jennifer Siebel Newsom. We use films and campaigns to challenge damaging and harmful gender norms and stereotypes so that everyone can reach their full human potential. And this interview is part of our hashtag Boys Will Be Boys series. It's a campaign to expose how traditional masculinity restricts men and boys and to create a space where men and boys can truly be themselves, their authentic selves. Boys Will Be Boys is a love letter to boys and men, and it means that they can be whatever they want to be without the constraints of restrictive masculinity. And I am so excited today to be introducing you to Byron Hurt, someone I have known and looked up to in this space for a very long time. We had a conversation beforehand, not a pioneer, but certainly one of the early people in this space who was advocating for boys and men and healthy masculinities. Let me tell you about Byron. This is an incredible bio. Byron Hurt is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. He is the former host of the Emmy-nominated series Real Works with Byron Hurt. I first was introduced to Byron's work through the acclaimed documentary Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was broadcast nationally on PBS. He is also a filmmaker. Another award-winning film with Soul Food Junkies aired on Independent Lens and also on the cable news station TV1. Byron's third film, Hazing, premiered at the 2022 Tribeca Film Festival and aired on Independent Lens in 2022. His documentary, Lee and Lisa's Family Tree, aired on PBS Nova in November 2023, and hopefully you're writing this all down. You must check out his work. Byron is currently working on a new short documentary called Men of Courage. It will be released later this year. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, CNN, MTV, BET, ABC News, you name it. Byron is a former adjunct professor at Columbia University's Journalism School in the documentary film program, and he will teach documentary filmmaking in the American Studies Media and Communications Department at SUNY College Old Westbury this fall. I'm sure I butchered that. I'm sure there's a New York way of pronouncing that, but welcome, Byron Hurt.
Thank you so much. And no, you did not butcher it. It was perfect. It was perfect.
Okay, good.
I haven't seen you in so long.
No, and I've lived on the East Coast, so I know there are rules about these things. It is really wonderful to see you. And I remember showing Beyond Beats and Rhymes to my students. What year would that have been?
It couldn't have been any time before 2006, 2007, okay. Right? So it had to have been somewhere around 2008, which seems like yesterday, but it's really not yesterday.
Time flying. And I remember the impact that it had on especially the men in my classroom. And I've shown it every year since. And so it's just a joy to be speaking with you, Byron.
Well, it's so amazing that a film that was made so long ago is still being utilized, by college professors and on college campuses. I just think that it just shows how necessary that film was at that time, and how relevant it still is, and the fact that there haven't been too many films that have come along to address these issues in the same kind of way. There have been some, but I feel really blessed and fortunate and thankful that the film is still being used as I intended it to be used, and that was to create conversation and dialogue, to get people thinking deeply about gender, masculinity. A lot of people think that film was about hip hop, and it really wasn't. It was a film about gender, right? And gender in music and gender in popular culture. So I'm glad that it's had the legs that it's had.
Well, Byron, let's start there. For folks who haven't seen that film, tell us a bit more about the premise and why that film is still relevant today.
Well, that film really started as a result of the work that I was in the midst of doing with Jackson Katz, who is the founder, the creator of the Mentors in Violence Project. At that time was the Mentors in Violence Prevention Project, now program. And, Jackson and I spent a tremendous amount of time traveling around, at first New England, colleges, universities in New England, high schools in New England, having conversations with boys and men and educators, also girls and women about men's role in the effort to reduce violence against girls and women around the country and around the world. And as I mentioned to you a little while ago, I was a young guy at that time, fresh out of college, did not know a whole lot about these issues. But I spent considerable time with Jackson Katz and others who worked with that program, and I learned a whole lot. And it was a period of time in my life where I really started to begin to question everything around me when it came to like gender, and that included representation, like various representations of masculinity and how they apply to my life as a Black man. I remember reading this book that I think Jackson bought for me called Cool Pose by Richard Majors. And there was a co-author, I think it was Janet Mancini Bilson or something like that, and Richard Majors. But Richard Majors was an African-American man. He wrote this book called Cool Pose, and I read it, and it really resonated with me because he was basically talking about my life. I mean, he's talking about what it's like as a young Black man growing up in American culture, where we were facing racism and white supremacy because we're Black and male. But then also it broke down some of the restrictions around manhood and masculinity that we also participate in. And so I learned a lot. And as a result, to answer your question, I really started to think deeply about hip hop and the music that I was listening to, right? And that I was uncomfortable with, some of which I rejected, some of which, I accepted or just completely normalized. But when I got down with the MVP program, I started to realize, wait a minute, there's a name for this, right? I mean, I started to formulate the language for the sexism and the the misogyny and the misogynoir that we see often in hip hop, the homophobia, the homoeroticism. And so I just decided to take it on, and make a film about it.
And it made a huge impact, a big splash at the time. And as you pointed out, these issues haven't gone away, still happening today. Let me take you back a little bit earlier than that, maybe, because this might be your origin story for this work, but I'm curious about your path to dedicating your life to gender justice work and healthy masculinities. And I know you weave together gender and race in really beautiful ways. But what is your personal story? How did you get to do this work?
It was really by happenstance, to be honest with you. I was a student at Northeastern University. I was a student athlete, heavily involved in many activities as a student. I had begun doing some community outreach work with the Center for the Study of Sport and Society prior to graduating. And, when it was time for me to graduate, I was looking for a job. I majored in journalism. And so it was really tough and challenging to break into broadcast television, especially in Boston, considering it's a pretty huge media market. So I was looking for some temporary work. And my athletic academic advisor, Keith McDermott, reached out to me one day and said, "Hey, I just got this notification or this job description that I think would be perfect for you. I think you should consider it. Go check it out." I went over to the Center for the Study of Sport Society, and the next thing I knew, I had a meeting with Jackson Katz and Richard Lapchek and Art. I can't remember Art's last name, but there was another gentleman named Art. The name will come to me, but they interviewed me for the position, and honestly, I was very nervous about taking it on because I didn't study gender in college. It wasn't like a career goal or aspiration of mine to be a male leader, on this issue and speaking out against all forms of gender violence prevention. So Jackson really challenged me to consider my role as a leader in my community, to consider the idea, the possibility of speaking out on this issue. And that's pretty much how it started. And I had to like really think deeply about, my upbringing, many of the things that I saw and witnessed inside of my home, outside of my home, the way that I was raised as a male in our society. Being a young football player, started playing football from the time I was 7 years old, all the way through college, and just understanding that there was a real problem around the socialization of boys and men that needed to be addressed. And so I decided to take it on. I decided to say yes when Jackson and Richard Lapchick offered me the position, and it changed my life. It was a really big turning point in my life.
What are the odds of heeding a call from Jackson Katz and, one of the early pioneers in creating the bystander intervention strategies,
Yeah.
and now, of
And,
course, becoming a leader so much in your own right, Byron. It's
well, I remember the moment when Jackson, sat me down and he asked me a series of questions. And, his questions were, I would say there were questions that no one had really asked of me before. And certainly no male had ever asked me about it before. And he asked me, how does violence against girls and women benefit the African American community? Right. Um, and he asked me if I consider myself to be a leader.
Hmm.
Those are the two questions that I remember that he asked me. And, you know, if I was being honest with myself, and I did my best to be honest in answering that question, it was clear that violence against girls and women in the African American community did not help us as a community. It doesn't make us better, doesn't make us stronger. Um, and I did consider myself to be a leader. So the question was then for me, did I have the courage to take this on and be a guy who spoke out on these issues? And at the time, I didn't know many men at all, if any, beside Jackson, who stood up and talked about these issues in a very public way and addressed other men. So there was a tremendous amount of trepidation and fear on my part, to do this work. I was very concerned about what my male friends would think about me, and my father and my uncles and other men in my life. It was very uncommon for a guy, especially a Black guy, to speak up on these issues publicly. There was some, but there weren't a whole lot. So as I said, I decided to take it on, and the rest is history, as they say.
So I'm curious, how did your uncles and the men in your life respond? How do they view you now?
How they view me now, or how they view me then?
I guess that the two questions. How did they initially respond?
I just think there was a little reticence. Like my father wasn't really all that excited about it. I remember my mother was much more excited than my father was at that point. I think my father questioned whether or not I had the knowledge base, to get into this work. I think a lot of men around me, my fraternity brothers, some of my ex-football teammates, and other men in my life kind of questioned my intentions or motivations, and that was a real challenging phase for me, right? Because I kind of almost had to begin to part ways with many people who were friends of mine and fraternity brothers, because I was beginning to change my own thinking and my own behavior, and I was beginning to confront people around me in ways that made people, the guys around me, uncomfortable. So rather than remaining silent in conversations where men, the guys around, my friends, now I'm not talking about some men that I don't know, I'm talking about guys in my social circle, in my space, would say things that were misogynistic or would engage in behaviors that were clearly problematic, abusive, and that sort of thing. I would raise my voice and say something about it. It became a problem. And so, my friendships with a lot of men around me began to dissipate, and I began to almost kind of sort of remove myself from those situations because it became too much of a conflict, an inner conflict. Nobody wants to be the person at the party who's like always,
Yep.
intervening and, saying something about something when people are trying to have a good time. But I did, though. There were a lot of moments where I did intervene in situations where I had to kind of walk the walk. I couldn't just talk the talk. and that did lead to some strained relationships and such. But my family members, I think, sort of respected what I did, although they may not have fully agreed with me. I remember I had a gender violence prevention workshop at my family reunion, which was interesting. I led a workshop. I facilitated a workshop at my family reunion. But that was the work that I wanted to do. I really felt like I wanted to reach as many people as possible, including my family members, because I thought it was important.
So you're just laying out the map for people who want to do this work. And I know there are a lot of folks who are going to be watching this either right now in real time or later,
Mhm.
and want to be able to do this work. And it sounds like, a really common experience, which is that you lose a lot of friends. Maybe it helps you decide who your real friends are. But I love this. So you started with your family. You did a
Friends
seminar
and family.
essentially at your family reunion. Oh, this is
Yeah,
great.
well, it was my friends, it was my family, and then of course, there was the work itself, which involved me standing up and addressing boys and men who at that time were much closer to my age. I was closer to their age, being a recent graduate of college, and so um it was a very interesting dynamic, challenging my peer group and encouraging my peer group to talk about these issues. So I learned a lot. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes in the early days. I think that I was a little bit more hardcore than I needed to be, and eventually I learned that engaging men and boys on this issue is more of an art, not a science.
Wow.
You know what I mean? And you have to be really skillful, and you have to allow some grace and understanding where boys and men are and meet them where they are, and just kind of help them think a little bit more critically about their attitudes and their behaviors and the attitudes and behaviors that they accept in their peer culture.
Mm.
So, as I said, I learned a lot, and I learned a lot from Jackson and other men who do this work, because, at the end of the day, you want to be effective as a trainer and as a leader. You don't, it's more important to be effective than it's important to be right, if you will.
Mm. Oh, I love that, Byron. Yes, meeting them where they are, right? Becoming more pragmatic. And you use, I would argue, the most powerful tool that we have for pushing back against restrictive masculinity, which is storytelling. So you've gone in a really very specific and effective direction of being a filmmaker in
Mhm.
order to shift hearts and minds. Can you tell us about how hypermasculinity in pop culture normalizes male violence and otherwise boxes men into the man box? And that's kind of the first part of the question, like, how is media part of the problem? And then how are you using storytelling to interrupt that?
Yeah, I think media is a huge part of it. It's all around us now more than ever. I mean, it's right here on my cell phone, right? I mean, all I have to do is pick up my phone and I'm engaging in social media, that's perpetuating a lot of images and tells stories about, gender in American society and around the world. And so it's a huge machine. And for those of us who do this work, that's what we're up against, and that's what we're sort of trying to address or combat, and it doesn't make it easy, because these images are pervasive. It's in the air that we breathe, and so for boys who are growing up, and young men and even older men, um, you don't have to go too far, to see the reinforcement of hegemonic masculinity. These are the representations of, really problematic images of manhood or maleness in our society. So, as a media maker, first of all, I really became interested in making films while I was a college student. I made my first film during the senior year, my senior year at Northeastern. And when I started working with Jackson and MVP, I thought to myself, okay, film is very, very powerful and it has the ability to reach a lot of people at one time, right? In some cases, millions of people at one time, right? I could exponentially expand my reach by using film, right? And addressing issues around like, masculinity and gender in my films to help broaden my reach, right? And the message of, that I'm trying to ultimately make on these issues. So that's how I joined the two. I just kind of felt like this was an area, filmmaking and gender was an area where I could make a pretty big impact as a storyteller. And so that's how I kind of fused the two to tell counter narratives about, the culture of masculinity.
And so effectively, right? And can you talk to us a little bit about your new project, the project you're working on with the young men in your community?
Yes, absolutely. So right, I live in the state of New Jersey, and so right now, I'm working on a documentary film, a short documentary film about 5 Black and brown men who are working in their local communities with boys and men, and having conversations with them about gender violence prevention, gender-based violence prevention. And so, I'm featuring 5 men in. One is in Newark, New Jersey. The other is in Paterson, New Jersey. One is in Trenton, New Jersey. The other is in Atlantic City. And the last one is in Salem, New Jersey. And these are all Black and brown men who are having conversations with boys and men in their local communities. And it's right up my alley, right? And I'm throwing my heart into it,
Mm.
trying to make something that is going to be able to have a big impact, in the world of gender violence prevention and hopefully beyond that. So I've been working on that, and we're probably going to release that sometime in the fall.
Okay, and we'll be on the lookout. Um,
Cool.
Shifting gears slightly, you have
Mhm.
written a lot and spoken a lot about the commonalities between race, class, and gender oppression, right? So the white supremacy system, racism, class oppression. Can you talk to us about how these three systems of power look similar in their functioning and operations, and also how they intersect when it comes to the man box?
Well, I think the best way for me to say it is that many of these issues are connected, right? So I'll just look at it from my perspective as an African American male. For a long time, I thought that being a young Black male was the biggest issue, the singular biggest issue when it comes to oppression. What I learned, though, is that Black women too also face a different kind of oppression. They are facing both racial and gender oppression, right? And then you have people who are non-binary, in communities of color, right, who are facing, race and gender oppression, but then also identity issues that they are facing as well, right? The oppression based on their gender identity and their sexuality. And so all of these things intersect. And so these issues they're intertwined with each other. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other, in my opinion. And that's not something I would be able to say, many years ago. I won't say how many years ago, but I'll just say many years ago, right? But I think it all kind of falls under the overarching system of patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism, right? That seeks to oppress and control women's bodies, seeks to control Black and brown bodies, seeks to control the other, right? Someone other than white and male and heterosexual. And so I think it's easy for people who have been affected by their um their individual case of oppression and look at it as if they're in a silo. But what's really happening is that we're all affected in different ways, right? And I believe it was Patricia Hill Collins who wrote Black Feminist Thought, who said that when you begin to start talking about who is oppressed more, right? Black men or Black women or any other category of people, then you're basically showing the success of the oppressor, right?
Mm.
And so that's something that really broadened my horizon and broadened my scope when I look at these issues.
Yeah, really, she pushes back against the oppression Olympics, right? And this idea that that's just another, that's a creation of another hierarchy. Yeah, intersectionality is the antidote to that. I love Andre Hanscock work on that too. Um, that's a that's a different conversation, maybe one that we could do at some point, but intersectionality so important in your work. And also another theme of your work is the power of leadership, right? You're a firm believer that positive male leadership, or based upon your work, I think you're a firm believer that positive male leadership and bystander intervention is really the key to ending gender-based violence. And your latest film project reflects this. Can you talk about the effectiveness of men as leaders in this space and also the bystander approach?
Yeah, I was thinking about this very deeply this morning. I was on a show with Kevin Powell. Kevin Powell is also someone who works on these issues, but he has a radio show. And I was a guest, and there were about maybe 12 to 15 other African American men who were on there talking about fatherhood in advance of Father's Day. And what's really interesting to me is that um it's important for men to talk about these issues. Like even in that phone call, the conversation that we had today, and it was a live radio show, it dawned on me that we as men still don't really talk about these issues that often, right? Amongst each other in groups. And I think it's important for us to continue to do it. I mean, I think we've come a long way. And certainly since 1993, when Jackson and I started doing this work, and there were other men who were doing this work as well, who were basically building on the work that women had been doing for many years, trying to get men to think a little bit more critically about our own behavior and stuff like that. I think when men, are are I think when men join each other in the same space and have conversations, like real honest authentic conversations about masculinity and our role in gender violence, I think it has a profound effect, because I think that we are all deeply affected by our socialization and our conditioning, especially Black men, right? And when you have a man who has the, I guess, like the self-awareness and the fortitude and the courage to actually, to say something and to talk about it in ways that are very unconventional. When I say it, I mean manhood and masculinity in a very unconventional way.
Yeah.
I think is really powerful, when other guys hear that. And it creates so much room and space and permission for guys to be open and to talk about their own experiences and to talk about their own thoughts and attitudes. And I just think that we need to have more of it. So the more men who speak out about these issues, the better for everyone. The better for us as men, the better for the girls and women in our communities, the better for, queer communities and non-binary people. It's really important.
Couldn't agree more. And I have one more question for you before we jump into some of the fantastic questions that the audience is putting in the Q&A. Encourage you folks, get in the Q&A now with your questions for Byron. We'll get through as many as we possibly can. But Byron, what would you say to your younger self right now if you could talk with him? What knowledge or advice that you've learned in your many years of doing this work would you share with him?
I would share a lot of things with my younger self, but I think when it comes to this issue and when it comes to just being a leader in general, is to be fearless, is to care a lot less about what other people think about you or what other people say about you, and to stand up and do what's right, you know, and to be unapologetic, about what it is that um you feel really strongly in this case, speaking out against all forms of gender violence. That's what I would say to myself. I made a film called Hazing, which we haven't talked about, but that film took a tremendous amount of courage. And I'm talking about, I'm speaking from my vantage point, me, you sort of being inside of my body and knowing what it took to muster up the strength and the courage to release that film. It took a tremendous amount of courage for me to do so, because I was challenging the cultural norms in my own fraternity, right? Of which I am still a member of, and that I participate in. And I wish that I had made that film 10 years earlier, but I just didn't have the courage to make that film, at that time, or even before that. I wish that I had the courage to kind of take on male culture in a way that was really unapologetic and really strong, but in a way that was also, empathetic and compassionate about the way in which boys and men are raised and conditioned in our society. Because I think that I probably would have made or would have been able to make a much bigger impact. But I also, I think would have freed and liberated myself earlier. People ask me about, my film Hazing. I feel so much more liberated today than I did prior to making that film, because I don't have to sort of be trapped in the performance of a certain kind of masculinity, because it no longer suits me, it doesn't fit me. And I've also stood in the face of it too. Like, I've stood in the face of the resistance to me making the film, if you know what I mean. So I just feel freer as a man and as a human being as a result of making the film Hazing, but also as a result of working on these issues as well. And I hope that more men um, see that as an opportunity to free themselves. And I'll just end.
Well, sorry, I know we will get to questions. Mark, yours is front and center at the top there. But let's talk a little more about Hazing. It's an incredible film, right? It's one of these like paradigm shifting films when it comes to fraternities, but you look at the intersections of different types of oppression, right? Race and gender and class is woven in there as well, and LGBTQIA plus. If someone watches Hazing, what are you hoping they take away from it? Tell us about this film.
Well, I hope that people have more confidence to share their story and to speak out against hazing culture. I hope that people get a better understanding about like why it happens and why people participate in hazing culture, some of the dynamics that exist there. I hope that people who are who are maybe inside of an experience where they are being hazed, that they will reconsider, right? And think more about themselves and about their own personal integrity in terms of their body, so that they would not allow anyone to violate it. I think that those are some of the things that I would want people to walk away with. I hope that people don't walk away with judgment, though. I mean, I did not make the film for people to stand in judgment of people who go through the pledge process, because at the end of the day, people do join these organizations. Many join for very legitimate reasons. And many people want to belong to something that is bigger than them. But I don't believe that people need to endure any sort of abuse or humiliation or degradation, or to go through anything that's going to endanger them in order to join a group
Mm,
or organization.
mhm.
And so those are some of the things that I hope people walk away with.
Yeah, and as always, you're meeting people where they are, and this idea that there's just one side to things. I mean, it is complicated, right? That's why you take it apart with storytelling. So Mark has asked a really compelling question. How might we reimagine a society where the construct masculinity does not exist for Black people and we replace it with another term?
We replace masculinity with another term, the
I
construct
think,
of
I think so. Yes. Yeah, the construct masculinity.
specifically for Black men is the question, not
That
men.
is, for Black people, that is how Mark is framing it.
Um, I don't know. That's an interesting question. I have to think about that. Um, I hope that I'm understanding the question correctly, but I will say that I know that there's been for many Black and brown men feelings of resentment and anger and hostility about so much emphasis and focus on the culture of masculinity, right? And the term toxic masculinity specifically. And I think that there are many Black men, and hopefully I'm in the same the same arena as what Mark is intended to ask. But I know that there are a lot of Black and brown men who don't really connect with this concept or idea of masculinity, because it's like a white male construction, and that black men sit outside of sort of like this larger construction of masculinity that has been presented to us by a system of like white supremacy and patriarchy, right? That we're somehow a part of that. But I would argue that many black and brown men have sort of bought into some of the ideals around hegemonic white masculinity in ways that don't really serve us. And so I think that we have to, as Black men, divorce ourselves from that as much as humanly possible. When I say that, I mean, this very rigid and limited this very rigid and limited construction of manhood and masculinity, right? The whole concept and idea of the rugged individual, so a man who is not empathetic or loving, a man who serves himself and not others, a man who uses violence, to control people and that sort of thing. So I think that the more we sort of distance ourselves or sort of divorce ourselves from that mindset, I think the more free that we become as Black men.
Mm.
I don't think that we can become free by investing in the same type of masculinity as the people who have historically oppressed us.
Mhm. Thank you. Shifting gears, an anonymous attendee asks, says, "Thank you for all of your work, Byron. How can we support your upcoming film?"
Um, there's no real way to support it at this time other than to spread the word about it. The name of the film is called Men of Courage. We're hoping to release the film sometime in the fall. I'm not exactly sure. But we definitely plan on like really bringing together, people within the gender violence prevention field, to build awareness about the film and to have some sort of a virtual premiere of the documentary, probably on YouTube. And we're looking at other platforms, streaming platforms that may house it. But right now, I would just say, just send me your positive energy is the best thing.
Sending right now.
Yeah.
Another anonymous attendee asks, "What has shifted, if at all, in representations of manhood in hip hop culture since you first released Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes?"
I think that the representations of Black masculinity and Latinx masculinity in hip hop have expanded on some level. I think that there's more space for queer men in hip hop than ever before. I think that just the aesthetic representation has changed a lot, so much so that there are many old school hip hop, dudes like myself, who are around my age or older, who are deeply uncomfortable, with some of the like the just the ways in which Black men and brown men are gender bending in terms of their choice of clothing and wearing skinny jeans or tight jeans or wearing skirts and things of that nature. And I think that it's presenting, some discomfort in some Black men. But I think that to me means that Black men are sort of growing beyond some of the limited notions of manhood and masculinity in ways that are really good. That being said, there's still a tremendous amount of misogyny. There's a lot of misogynoir, hatred, specific hatred toward Black girls and Black women. And there's still, a certain level of homophobia. But that has also shifted. I mean, there have been many artists who have spoken out against homophobia and have spoken in support of gay rights and gay marriage and that sort of thing. And that wasn't really happening around the time that I made Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes.
Great. That's progress, right? And we can feel
Some
that.
progress, but
I'm
we
here,
need more. We need more
of
because
course.
it's still deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. I will say, I just came from, I was at Tribeca this weekend and I watched a film by Dream Hampton called "It Was All a Dream," and it's a film that features footage from like 1993 to 1995 of certain rappers, the Notorious B.I.G., Method Man, several other rappers. And Dream at that time, Dream Hampton, who was a legendary hip hop writer and a filmmaker, was challenging a lot of the Black rappers about their misogyny and sexism in the music. And that was, it really struck me because she was way ahead of her time as a woman who was confronting some of those tropes and those stereotypes and those representations of manhood in rap music, hip hop culture then. So we owe a lot to, many of the veteran hip hop journalists, women who were confronting misogyny in the 90s, right? That have sort of made it a little bit less acceptable for rappers to be misogynistic in such an open and hostile way.
Yeah, it makes me think of Dr. Trisha Rose too, who was writing about this
Oh
way
yeah,
before anyone else.
oh, yeah, yeah. I love Trisha Rose.
Yeah. Anonymous asks, I appreciate you sharing your journey to understanding and accepting intersectionality. Are there other ways your views and beliefs have shifted since you started doing this work?
Um, I can't really think of any other ways that it has shifted. I just think that I'm constantly growing. I'm constantly evolving. I think the greatest movement for me has probably been around issues of like sexual identity, um, you know, queerness, queer culture. But I think that that's because I've been willing to do the work and to listen and to learn and to accept what I don't know and try to learn more about experiences that are not of my own,
Mhm.
and be open to including voices who have been left out, especially in the Black community, and giving them safe spaces to talk and to be free to be who they are. And so it's one of the reasons why I've tried to include those voices in my films, so that there's representation, but also to help straight men move, right? Like gain some movement, when it comes to homophobia, because it's something that we really need to address.
Mm, great. Yeah, it's incredible how quickly our understandings can change when you're doing social justice work, right? Language we used 5 years ago, we're not using today. It's kind of a joyful journey and thinking about ways to be more inclusive and more sensitive and just that
Right,
constant.
exactly. Right. And that's what I mean. I mean, just being more intentional about how I'm thinking about these issues and just being more inclusive, as you said.
John has a great question. He says, or they say, thanks for this great discussion. As another man engaged in this work, are there any priority policies or legislative areas that male identifying folks should be getting more involved in or more vocal about to further gender equality, equity, and justice?
That's a good question. That's a big question. I think, you know, women's reproductive rights is on the ballot, right? And we just had the Supreme Court made a major decision today that I think is a step in the right direction. But I think that we as men have to be more vocal, if you haven't done so already, be more vocal in supporting women when it comes to their reproductive rights, because they're clearly on the table. And we have conservatives and Republicans whose agenda it is to take us back to the 1950s, if not earlier, when it comes to women's reproductive rights. So we have to fight against that, and I think we have to be strong allies and advocates, for women in that regard.
Mm, great, thank you. Um, yeah, big decision this morning. Whew. Chad asks, how do you coach, advise, counsel, and teach athletic coaches and directors on appropriate masculinity in competitive sports?
Well, I haven't really been in the room with a lot of coaches as of late. It's work that I did often with Jackson in the early days of MVP, as well as doing work in the U.S. military. I think the most important thing is getting the ear of coaches and letting them know how important their voice is and the influence that they have as leaders of boys and men to make a difference, right? And to get boys and men to prioritize these issues. And it goes back to the conversation or the question that we had a little bit earlier about the importance of men hearing from other men, boys and men hearing from other men on this topic. Um, one really successful way to get the ear of coaches, the men who coach boys, is talking about their own daughters, the daughters that they have in their lives, and how important it is for their daughters to live in a world that's safe for themselves. I think appealing, whatever you can do to appeal to their self-interest, to get them invested in these issues, I think is really important. I mean, they should be concerned about women's safety in general, but we know that that's not the reality. So I think just like young boys and men, young athletes, we have to reach coaches where they are too. And I think, we have to encourage them to make these conversations mandatory, because if not, boys and men are they're not gonna have access to men who are influential, who speak out about these issues. So I think hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's, yes, right, a great answer, which is tapping into their leadership, right? I don't know how many of them, I'm sure they realize the impact and to some extent that they have in the lives of boys and young men, but really
You
tapping
know,
into harnessing that power.
my experience as a player, and then someone who has worked with coaches, coaches can tend to be very single-minded in their focus and only think about the sport that they coach
Mm,
or sports in general. So many of them haven't even really thought about these issues deeply or considered, being someone who would address these issues. But I think, when you do get their ear and you have, a coach who's willing to make the effort to talk about these issues, I think it does make a big difference. I mean, one of the men that I'm featuring in the short film that I'm working on, he works with coaches. And one of the things that he says in his interview, that coaches are the ones who have the respect and the admiration of the boys that they have access to, right? And when you can get a coach, who can not only talk about, our role as men to end violence against girls and women and to treat girls and women with respect, um, you know, you and you can reinforce that, right? After practice and throughout the football season or throughout whatever athletic season it is, then that can over time make a big difference. We just need more coaches who are willing to do that.
yes, yes, indeed. Like Joe Earlman, who's featured in The Mask You Live In, who
Yeah.
talks about agrees with you very much on this. So Mark has added a question. Gender-based violence is bi-directional. How might we engage discussions centering Black boys and men who are harmed emotionally, physically, sexually, mentally by girls and women? Yeah.
Well, I think that that's a really good question. And I think we do have to confront and address the trauma that many Black boys and men have experienced throughout their lives, wherever that trauma has wherever it has come from. We talked about that a bit on the radio show this morning, that there are many Black boys and men who have experienced trauma. And because of the nature of, masculinity in our society, we don't necessarily talk about it. We don't have a lot of spaces to talk about it. Um, I'm not going to go as far. I mean, I know that Black boys and men can oftentimes be traumatized by the women in their lives, particularly their mothers, but I don't want to walk down that path of blaming Black women for the societal issues and the wrong and the problems that exist with Black boys and men. That being said, I think that trauma, wherever it comes from, is real. And I think we have to be able to put that trauma into a much larger context, right? Because even if that trauma comes from or comes at the hands of a Black woman, that Black woman probably has been traumatized in ways that has not really been dealt with or addressed. So there are oftentimes Black women who have been traumatized by the men in their lives, whether it's their father or their stepfather or some other male in their life. And that trauma presents itself in their parenting of their boys, and we may see it come out in that way. Um, so I think, that's kind of like an intraracial conversation that needs to take place about the collective trauma that we experience, both from white supremacy, from Black patriarchy, and up and down and sideways and back and forth. Those are sort of internal conversations that we must continually have in order for us to become a healthy community.
Thank you. Anonymous asks about the male loneliness epidemic. They say, do you think there is a place for hazing in the pursuit of building brotherhood and relationships between men, especially during a time when men are facing such a crisis of loneliness, or is it always destructive?
Yeah, can you read that again, please? I'm sorry, the first part of it.
Yes, so the heart of the question is about hazing
Yeah.
and whether or not, given the epidemic of male loneliness, is hazing always bad? Or is there a place for this in building community amongst men?
Yeah, I don't think that hazing helps to build community. I think that that's a myth, and I think that there's this idea that hazing fosters bonding, between boys and men. But I think that research shows it actually alienates and builds resentment among boys and men, and it reproduces violence against other boys and men. So I think anytime, we are reproducing violence or reproducing trauma against other men in order to quote unquote bond, I think we need to figure out ways to reconsider that way of thinking, and think of healthier ways of, coming together as men. Someone, I can't remember who told me, but somewhere along the way when I was making hazing, they said that one of the things that boys and men are looking for more than anything else is connection, right? They're looking for ways to connect with other men in ways that feel more authentic,
Mm,
that feel more genuine and loving and respectful. Like, in other words, just like getting to know each other, having conversations with each other, right? Bonding in ways that are not harmful or endangering someone's life, where they have to binge drink in order to prove their manhood, in order to be a member of your group or organization.
mm,
So I think ultimately, what boys and men want is I think they want to build genuine relationships and genuine connections with other boys and men. And I think that we have to give boys and men more space and permission to do that in healthier ways, be beyond hazing. If you look at the definition of hazing, you're basically, you're using you are trying to um you're reproducing very harmful strategies in order to make someone feel as if they are a worthy member of your group or an organization. And so that's what I think we need to do away with.
thank you. And another question about hazing. What enabled you to develop the courage to make your film Hazing? And what can young people draw upon to develop similar courage to express their beliefs and share their perspectives?
I was able to draw upon the experiences that I had working in the field and having conversations with boys and men over the years, and girls and women, but mostly the work that I did with boys and men. I think that helped to really build up the fortitude that I needed to make hazing. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back for me, that really that made me say, okay, I'm gonna do this, was just reading and watching, the stories of, frankly, two young men who died from hazing. And I felt that I was well positioned, that I had the cultural competency, that I had the credibility as someone who worked in this field for a long period of time, to take on these issues. And so that helped me, take it on. But as I said earlier, it did require a tremendous amount of courage on my part to actually make that step. And it took a lot of courage for me to put the film out into the world. Now, you know, and I will have to say that I've received a tremendous amount of backlash as a result of putting the film out into the world. Okay. So the fear that I had was in some way warranted because what I expected to happen happened, right? But that being said, what the film also did was that it opened the door for men who had been wounded, who had been traumatized, who had been harmed from hazing, right, in their experiences while joining or pledging an organization. And it freed them, the film freed them to speak openly about it and to feel as if they had been heard. And so that was as equally as much of a response as the backlash that I received. And to me, that made it all worth it.
Well, on that note, Byron, where can folks find you, follow your work, support your work?
Yeah, so I mean, my website is bhurt.com, and I'm on social media at Byron Hurt. My films, many of my films, including Soul Food Junkies, Hazing, and my most recent film, Leon Liza's Family Tree, they're all available on Prime Video, Apple TV, and Xfinity. So if you go to those platforms and you search for Hazing or works by Byron Hurt, you should be able to find them there. My film Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes is available at the Media Education Foundation. That's mediaed.org. Also, if you want to watch my very first professional film, I Am a Man, Black Masculinity in America, that's also available primarily for educators at the Media Education Foundation, which is mediaed.org.
Ooh, what an incredible conversation. Thank you for this time you've taken and for, your body of work and for being such a great feminist activist.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate all the work that you've done over the years. You've been really gracious and inviting me to your campus to address your students. And I'm very proud and happy of all the work that you've done with the Representation Project, which I love. And I just wish you all of the best moving forward and your next move in life.
Thank you, Byron. And we'll have you
Welcome.
back to campus sooner rather than later.
All you gotta do is reach out to me.
Thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day, y'all.